You're welcome to another episode of Black Royalty Radio. Super excited about this episode to be interviewing the my starting pioneer with this whole thing, the person who's been with me from the very beginning, as early of a beginning as I could possibly think of, Dr. Celeste A. Rivers, who I more formally call Mom. Or I guess I don't call you Mom, I call you Ma. But Ma, you've been a teacher all my life, right? But I don't necessarily know the start of that career, right? Let's start at the beginning to frame this conversation, and then we'll get into all the myriad of ways that this conversation can go. So first off, did you always want to be a teacher? Was that like your big goal in life to be a teacher?
So, in communication, that's a great question, but um, you would have to know what people mean by teacher. Because I always wanted to be a mom, so technically, I always wanted to be a teacher. Did
Yeah.
I formally want to work for an institution as an educator of children? No, not really.
Yeah.
Um,
Was it always a connection for you, teaching and being a mom? Like, did you always then go into your classroom as though they were your student, as though they were your children?
That's a great question formed that way. I always treated children like they were my own. I did for them what I would do for my own children. Yes, absolutely. And I started teaching like before I was like old enough to teach in like Bible school. I did the counseling thing. And I remember on one of my first experiences, I had the class that nobody wanted,
Mhm.
full of teenagers of 16 to 18-year-olds. No, I'm sorry, 14 to 16-year-olds. And a couple of my students were older than me, but they didn't know it.
This is your introduction to teaching?
Yeah, because then like when we I used to play this game where you were the teacher, you used to mimic your teacher. So when you asked me about it, I guess I always kind of sort of wanted to do it. I just knew I wanted to work with children.
Mhm.
But there's a power to teaching that it's just like it's drawing. And I
Mhm.
guess some people love it and some don't.
Yeah.
And power not in terms of controlling, but there's power in being able to support someone as a learner,
Yeah.
because empowering others is an empowering thing, or for me it's very motivating.
So I talked about power dynamics on my last episode when I was talking to Dr. Tyrone Howard. It came up also in my first episode when I talked to a history teacher, Leo Glaze, and Leo was talking about how his kids will just call him by his first name. In his classroom, they call him Leo, right? I'm currently teaching a class called Technologies of Power, and we're investigating like the dynamics of power and the way technologies play into that. All of this to say, power dynamics have kind of been in my mind for a while now, and it's particularly interesting to me when it comes into a classroom, right? I think the power dynamic between a teacher and a student is one, unique, two, necessary, and also unnecessary at different times, right? You have to have like this balance of it. So I'm interested to hear, like, how did you learn to navigate the power dynamic in your classroom? How did you learn to own the power that you had as a teacher to empower the learners when, like, in your very first class, you have you have students who are older than you, right? And I'm like, is that something that just comes to you naturally, or what were the bumps in the road that kind of walked you down that path?
So great question. And when watching the interview with Leo, if I may just say Leo, because he's so personable on the screen, I haven't never met him personally. Um, but what I liked about his expression of power, in my opinion, he was powerful not because he said, I'm in charge and I'm powerful, but because he understood who he was in the dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
and the part that he wrestled with internally, he dealt with internally. So he was able to present himself as power. And I believe, I don't want to misquote him, but one of the things he says is that, or what I took from what he said is, some of the powerful people don't need to say I'm powerful,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
don't need to say that I'm in charge. They just are. It's just like when you look in your classrooms, you have students who just command themselves and the environment without saying, oh, hey, that's a leader in the classroom.
Mhm.
So, to your question, part of it has to do with coming to terms with your own inherent power, or and recognizing it as such,
Mhm.
and not going into a teaching learning environment to demonstrate that I am powerful,
Mhm.
but how can I bring out the best of those in front of, and that are in front of me,
Yeah.
right? So you'd have to really define what power is. Power really is tremendous influence,
Right.
and if you're not influencing them to do better, you're not really powerful, even though you have authority.
True. So you always had this kind of understanding from day one, just like off of living the life that you lived up to that point.
Well, I understood that there there's a difference between going in and running a classroom and
Mhm.
going in and having a teaching experience.
Mhm.
For me, lines were clear because when I grew up, like, you understood, and you there was respect for authority, and we could have a whole episode on that. But
Mhm.
just my backdrop in what was acceptable behavior from children and what was not,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So I never felt disrespected by my students because I never allowed them to disrespect me, but I
Mm.
also didn't disrespect them.
So that's really interesting because like one of the things I don't remember what I've had a lot of conversations. I talk all the time. But to navigate that power dynamic, then when I knew you as an educator, you were actually my dean for my elementary school career, right? So you had to learn to navigate this line of being also a disciplinarian. And obviously, you've been my mother all my life. You've had, right, you've had to hold that line for me as well. But how do you navigate being a disciplinarian and the power that comes with being a disciplinarian, and like setting boundaries that are you're not allowed to cross, right, for students, while building that relationship that allows for all the things that you're talking about, and like letting them have some agency in that and things of that nature.
So, great question. So, there's a book that I read pieces of early on, but this phrase always stuck with me, and it's been one of my um, background filters for how I operate with children, and it's called discipline with dignity,
Okay.
right? And one of the things as I became a teacher trainer is that you can discipline without ripping the heart out of a child, and you know the difference,
Uh-huh.
right? You can tell by their response. And you can also tell what you're trying to do with that power. If your objective is to be right
Yeah.
and to, win over this child, you've already lost, right? So
Mhm.
creating win-win, and always viewing the learner as an individual, right?
Mhm.
My methodology has never been sage on the stage and just regurgitate to me what you know. It's
Mhm.
like, okay, where are you, and how can I get you to where you need to be so that you can get to where you want to go,
Right. Right.
right?
Right.
So that backdrop in thinking, like, discipline is another expression of love.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I used to always tell to my students when I was dean
Yeah.
is
About you.
when I was the dean, it's like, you know what? People that correct you care about you.
Yep. Oh, I
If
said.
I let you do whatever you want, I'm not helping you. You don't need me here.
Mhm. Mhm.
But people that correct you care about you.
Right.
So when we stop thinking of discipline as a punishment, and stop thinking of discipline as a weapon instead of a tool, then we use it incorrectly.
Yeah. Now, whenever I talk about you being a dean, it's almost, it's not traumatic for me, but it always rings in my head as a certain amount of trauma. Because Because there were other adults in the school building who didn't have that kind of understanding and who weren't trying to build relationships with us, who weren't trying to uh, uh, manage their power in a good way, right? They were actively letting their ego trip and getting us in trouble for all sorts of things. Some of us, some of it was deserved, some of it less so. But what did you start to notice about the way that other teachers ran their classrooms, or that other adults in the community managed their power dynamic, that made you ultimately want to turn from student facing to working with faculty and adults in the community as well?
That's a big question. So I don't think it's not one thing in isolation.
Okay.
Um, because it started out very different. Like I understood when I was that teenage um counselor or leader for that group.
Uh-huh.
I thought I had to be like rough and tough because to get to them, but I was also personable because I understood them because we were like the same age. So one of the most impactful things that happened to me, because being a dean, you have to be kind of thick-skinned because you don't want to be. Well, at least I didn't. I don't want to be the guy that um, caused the distress, and you're not the likable person. Like it's not like, oh yay, let's go to the dean, but
Right.
but it kind of is too,
Right.
right?
Right. It depends
So
on why you're coming.
so
That
what
is so
happened
cool.
was
Yeah. I'm
when
sorry.
you take the balance, right? And your work is an expression of who you are as opposed to what you do.
Mm-hmm.
There were over 100 children in the camp this particular year,
Mm-hmm.
right? And teenagers or preteens are mm, historically one of the least, groups that people abound towards. They don't, let's raise their hands like, oh yeah, give me those guys, especially when they're raw and in a summer situation or a fun situation where there's really no technical boundaries because they're like, this is, it's not school and you're not the boss of me. Anyway, so this group, it wasn't without challenges, but at the end we had this closing ceremony, right?
Uh-huh.
Where they introduced all of the teachers. Now, of course, because we were the oldest group, mine went last. So they went from the kindergarten all the way up to us. When they got to my group and they called my name, when I tell you every child in the entire camp stood up and was screaming to the top of their lungs. I'll never forget that day.
Uh-huh.
And to the point where this is embarrassing to me because they kept going on.
Right.
So finally, I let them go for a little bit. I turned around and did just like this. And on a dime, they stopped and sat. And everybody in the room, well, I was trying not to bring attention to myself. Everybody in the room turned and snapped their head and looked at me like, well, how did you do that?
Wow.
But it was because of relationship, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so every group that I've been in so far, I build that kind of relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them with those boundaries, again, discipline with dignity,
Yeah.
there were things that you knew not to try in front of Dr. Rivers and
Right.
you knew not to say,
Right.
but you knew that she was going to
Right.
listen carefully, and be fair. You
Okay.
wouldn't always like what she did, but you knew she was going to be fair.
Yeah. So I wanna keep following your career growth, but I want to kind of sit there for a second, because like that's not just normal to know how to build those relationships and to know how to connect with people on that level, and to be able uh, um, to connect with students in that way, right? Like as a dean now, right, and being able to hit certain plateaus career wise, I couldn't have done what I'm doing now with the same mindset that I did when I was starting out, right?
Absolutely.
There's a lot of growth that comes in that process, and I'm kind of really interested to hear like about what you've been doing from the start that allows for you to have that kind of space where every time, whether it's a summer camp, whether it's your own class, whether it's a grade level, whether it's your whole school, right, you have this relationship with students so that they feel heard on one hand, but also held to that standard that is like unmistakable, right, and very clear, and we're not allowed to do that, and we just don't.
I guess one of the things is I don't pretend that the behavior makes no sense whatsoever. Even though it's not appropriate for a space, something within the individual told them it was okay to do this. Now, a lot of people don't take that road because it is time consuming. Like I spent a lot of time just talking to the children, which made my paperwork go to the end of the day. And there's balance in that, you know, so I'm not suggesting everybody do what I did, but finding your place and your voice to where you don't have to have the answer, but you're willing to explore to come to an amicable solution. Right? For example, one time this was this whole big thing where the teacher brought the student into me, again a middle school child, and she was up in arms because he cursed in her class, you know, and carried on. And it was like 3 boys, and I mean they let her have it because she said something and they used their vocabulary to tell her something else. Right?
Yeah.
So when the boys came into me, and I was like, all right, first of all, let's not act like this didn't happen. Let's not act like you don't talk like this. But there's a way you talk when you're with the boys, and on the basketball court, there's a way you talk when you're in school. And so we went through a whole thing, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but for time, I'm making it shorter. If the human response is fight or flee, right? And I'm trying to get to amicable. So I'm taking the teeth out of the lion. First of all, is I'm acknowledging that you did it and something brought you there. Like, what made you feel that you had to express yourself this way? So by the time the child tells me, usually it's because they were embarrassed or they had a different understanding of what was going on. So all that to say is humanizing the person to where they're able to acknowledge their part, and how do we move forward?
Right.
And it doesn't always mean that it's going to go 100% either direction, but at least I feel heard, right? Even if I don't agree.
Right. And I think part of what makes you royalty, among many of things, is that you give students that space. You give that patience to learn the story behind what happened, to get to their perspective, start where they're at, and then grow through that. Right. However, that's not the case across the board. And in fact, when we kind of come down to a 5-foot view on this thing in real time, a racial dynamic is often introduced to that as well. When you're talking about a power dynamic, when you're talking about why students do things. One of the things Dr. Howard brings up in his conversations all the time is about preschool suspension rates, right? What does a preschooler do to be suspended from school, right? And we can dig into that as well, but ultimately what it comes down to is the expectations that you have on certain students. And those expectations, yes, they're as different as we are, but a lot of them are steeped in a racial society that we live in, right? This can be theory on one hand, but you experience this as a student, right? You've been in classrooms, you've been the Black face in classrooms where anything that you say isn't necessarily heard because the expectation is what it is, and you're already wrong, right? So I remember being in school at times where it wasn't a conversation I was having with this teacher. It was them telling me that what I did was wrong and I should be punished for it. And they're irate because they feel offended because their ego is tied up in this power dynamic, right? As a teacher, they couldn't handle the power dynamic. And as a growing Black man, I was learning more and more about power and the power that the world wouldn't give me, which I desperately wanted, right? And would claw for in any way that I could find. And we can have that conversation later. But all this going back to the power dynamics that are present in class, how and particularly Black students feel this heavier, right? Without a certain sense of cultural sensitivity. I know I kind of gave you a lot there, but where I want to start with is as we continue your career path, you ultimately get a PhD. and the focus of your doctoral thesis is Black males, right? Black males in school. Can you talk to me a little bit about the power dynamic that is present in schools, particularly as it relates to educators and their Black students, and times that you've been the kind of saving grace for a student where a situation could have went really one way, but because you were in that conversation, you could see it a different way because you were giving them a certain grace, because you were understanding where they came from, and just kind of open to them being something other than the stereotype, kind of saved them.
Wow.
Can you talk about that for a second?
Wow. So many events come to mind. I almost feel like that was my ruling mantra, perspective. And as you were speaking, I'm thinking about context. Context changes everything. And in full circle, it goes back to that power dynamic, because I have been in charge of an entire building where the decision whether to suspend or not to suspend laid in my hands. And I've also been in a situation where it was necessary to suspend a preschooler. It was mandatory because it was unsafe, because this was a child that threw chairs, right, and was causing harm to others. So in isolation, we can't make blanket statements. And that's another thing about deciding when to suspend. When the rules are loose, it comes down to judgment, which is skewed. So this is like a deep rabbit hole, because here's where we get off track, right? School is an academic institution.
Mm-hmm.
So the decisions that are made regarding suspension really should be based on, does this impede the learning of that particular student and the students around them?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what is the best scenario to where we can have the learning of the individual not interrupted and the learning of those around him? And can the teacher still perform in this environment? Because as an administrator, you also have to be conscious of the ability and the place where the teacher in front of them is. Because if they feel disempowered, they're also not effective to do their best teaching. So there's a lot of dynamics, and I know people want a really quick answer, but that's the thing. Children are not widgets.
Mm-hmm.
So while we can have guidelines, we need that formative training that gives teachers available strategies and options while they empower students to be their best selves, right? Mm-hmm. So an example of that would be my first formal position as a dean. There was a student who, to this day, he found me and reached out to me. I'll tell you that at the end of the story. But anyway, when I came in, everyone in the building knew this child by name. Mm-hmm. And they would only say what their poor experiences with this child. So this child never had the opportunity to, like, he had to live up to their low expectations, because he was not given an option. Because teachers who did not even have him in class would say, oh, there he is, or you're up to whatever.
Yep.
And he had his ways.
It gets passed around the water cooler, and it becomes like the story of this kid. Yeah.
The script, right? This is the script, and this is how you have to talk to him. Mm-hmm. So 2 things happened with this child. This was when they was really, like, they still do the standardized test or whatever. Mm-hmm. So my first assignment was to monitor this child in the building while the assessment was being given, so he wouldn't disrupt the building, because he had the potential to disrupt the building, which was large, but that's the kind of community it was. Anyway, so I'm sitting in a meeting, and it's my first voice. The principal's here, the assistant principal's here, and at least 3 of the teachers who have had him, and they're discussing, well, he can go here this period, here this period, here this period, take care of. And I'm sitting there like this. And in my head, I'm like, why is he not taking the test, right? Mm-hmm. So then the principal finally, she's looking at my face, and she turns and she says, well, what do you think? I said, so honestly, I said, I don't know why we're finding a place for him when we haven't even tried to allow him to take the test.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, well, because he's going to disrupt. I said, well, we know what he has done, but we actually don't know what he will do.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, and I'm willing to sit in the room with him, just be another proctor. And they said, okay, well then that's it. So we'll have somebody available to take him out when he starts to be disruptive, but you can sit with him because this is a 3-hour test. No problem. I met with the child before the test. I said, this is what we're not going to do. I said, on this test, I want you to do your best.
Mm-hmm.
Doing nothing is not an option.
Mm-hmm.
If you get tired, your option is to lay your head down or to give me the eyes and we can take a walking break. What you won't do is speak during this test, throw anything, or get up out of your chair.
Mm-hmm.
Done.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I said, nobody knows who you are until you show them. So I need you to do your best, your very best, right? Mm-hmm. P.S. I didn't get a peep out of the child. I was ready to take him for a walk or whatever, because this is all I've heard going to school, which is another reason why I don't like people telling me about children before I meet them.
Yep.
But anyway, he took the test. And everybody's mouth is hanging open because the principal said, okay, try it.
Yeah.
But you how could you tell me what he was going to do? No one knows the future like that. And you didn't give him an opportunity to try it.
Yeah.
I developed a really great relationship with this child, and he ended up being one of my students because he I'll get to that in a second, but they were not even going to give him a chance. So you asked me what was one of the things that I saved. He took that test, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Don't remember the scores, and I'm not going to make up a wonderful story, but the fact is he got through the entire test, and everybody was shocked that he did.
Right.
So of course he became my student, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, he listens to you. You don't listen to anybody else. Yeah, okay, that's a whole nother story.
Mm-hmm.
So when he came into my class, I think it was the following year, a class that I started out with 43 children. And
Wow.
the cap was supposed to be 34, right?
Yeah.
And I had 4 paras, almost a brand new teacher at the time. At any rate, we decided to put on a play, right? And I gave him a part. It was a small part, but I needed, when we were practicing using our different times, I needed to be able to have my eyes on him and give him something to do.
For sure. When
I gave him a part, he cried. And this is a kid that didn't let anybody see him. He was a tough kid.
Yeah.
And he said, nobody ever gave me a chance before. He said, this is my last year. I never was ever in a play. I always got put out. Wow. And when I tell you, he did such an amazing job. Yeah. And I say that with confidence, making this story shorter, about 5 years ago, I think about 5 years ago now, he contacted me. He said, I found you online. He said, and I wanted to tell you, thank you. He says, you're the only one that ever gave me a chance. And I hear stories like that, but I was like, whoa, like it really did. Cause he knew what he was doing. He wasn't that kid. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So P.S. that was one of the top stories that comes to mind, but there are countless stories where I know, cause I could see people, I could see the adults in the room glaring at me while I brought up the child's side.
So did that happen before or after your PhD?
That was before.
So was that something that confirmed something that you had already been suspecting and already been picking up on, and it was like a real tangible example for you? Or was it something that sparked a thought process in you that ultimately led to your focus in your PhD work?
Great question. So when you asked before, did I always want to be a teacher? No, I always wanted to focus on my children, right? And my first...
You always wanted to be a mother, point blank, period.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, just because that was why?
Why did I always want to be a mother?
Yeah.
I think I always loved kids. I don't know. Maybe because I was, you know what? Maybe because I was the youngest and I always thought that I wanted to provide things for kids that people missed for me. Uh-huh. And I originally wanted to be a pediatrician. Okay. Right. But when I found out, and I'll never forget it, I was like 7.5 or just turned 8. And when I realized that the pediatrician had to give children needles and needles weren't a good thing, I said, I'm not doing that. I didn't want to do it. Like, I knew I wanted to work with kids, but I was not doing the needle thing. Like, I'm not going to be a bad guy, right? Turned out to be the bad guy another way, but bad guy can be a good guy.
Yeah.
So that's what sparked it. And when my children were little, I spend an inordinate amount of time in the school on PTA and whatever to help out, because that's just what you do. And truthfully, it was easier than going back and forth for several hours. So I just, hung out there. So I ended up actually doing a lot of things and watching how classrooms were run.
Yeah.
And I was just able to recognize why kids weren't getting it. I didn't have the voice or the authority to say something.
Right.
But I was like, this is not how you do this. This is
Yeah.
not how you do this.
Yeah.
Right. And so as I began to go work in the classroom, the theories that were in my head were actual, because my children started performing.
Yeah.
They started performing. And in my second year, I had a 5th grade class of all underachievers, because when you can do discipline in brown schools, they give you all of the problem children, and they don't even have to be a brown school, but a school that has a brown population that they can't handle.
Yeah.
So these were the children that they had deemed as weren't going to get anywhere. They were on the lower spectrum, and that year, every single one of my children passed.
Right. Ooh.
Every single one of them.
What qualifications did you have going into that those first classrooms?
Motherhood. Motherhood taught me a lot.
Fair. That's
no
fair.
joke.
That's fair.
You don't have 6 children and not learn anything.
Very true. Okay, and then can you give me it probably won't be quick, but can you give me a rundown of the titles and kind of degrees that you amassed over the time span of your career? So you started out as a classroom teacher.
I started out as a camp counselor, because I think that's very important to understand the dynamics. Yeah, because camp counselors develop relationships with children that are important in classroom, and they do the social piece that's very understated in the classroom. They do the personability, and they do the rewards, the joy of being with children, and like, what do we learn doing fun things, right? And people forget that in classrooms, right? They forget to let kids be kids because they want them to have these scores or these grades or these labels, right?
Good point.
So I don't dismiss that.
Okay.
So counseling, I was never a paraprofessional, but I was a teacher's aide.
Okay.
Right. The parent association, because I got to see different teachers and different methodologies was important, and seeing different classrooms. Then the teacher, I was a teacher leader. I was a dean of discipline, a dean of academics, an instructional coach, a universal literacy coach, an administrator, right? For a period of time, and in between different certifications.
Okay. And your degrees are in?
I have a bachelor's in psychology. I have a master's in special education. I have an annotation in autism, and a doctorate in education. There's a little bit of something.
Just a few. Of all the things that you've amassed, do you feel like the classroom work and the teacher preparation work that you've gone through is like do teachers need more certification work before they go into their own classroom, or did you learn most of what you learned just kind of through reflection and experience and kind of trial by fire kind of thing?
I think that there is basic training should look different than it looks, right? For what you do with bodies in front of you, because in my experience, the academics of teaching gives you a different picture of what hands-on in the classroom teaching is,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's those intangible, non-textbook things that often make or break whether a teacher stays in teaching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? So I believe that mentorship is a huge part.
Yeah.
And that there should be someone, a go-to someone that a teacher can check in with. Like coaching, I think coaching is one of the most phenomenal positions in education.
Okay.
Because coaching is different than supervising, it's different than partnering, it's different than training and
Yeah.
teaching. Because coaching is down and dirty and immediate application.
And teacher coaches, is that like a one-off thing? Because you say coaching and my mind goes athletics, but
Okay.
I know that's not what you mean right now. So you're
I'm
talking
talking,
about a teacher coach. Is that a position that schools have, or is it just?
yeah, they're instructional coaching,
Uh-huh.
not and the administrator in the building decides whether they want one. You
Okay.
have you have literacy and math coaches, and then you have what I was a universal literacy coach, which by far is like one of my favorite things to do, supporting children and adults like to how to read because it's so empowering, but that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
But that coaching is very specific,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're identifying a need, but not based on coach down. This is a peer interaction and a support interaction at the same time, because then the teacher identifies the area that they would like to be supported on.
Mm-hmm.
In between, you're having conversations about noticings, and
Yeah.
so all it does is empower and grow you and grow you and grow you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like it's in real time.
Okay.
It's not like, okay, oh, I went to this workshop, let me try this out, and then I don't know if I messed it up or not, or I don't even know where I did. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm not seeing the evidence of my work in XYZ. What should I do? Then we talk about it. I model it.
Yeah.
I do it with you, and then I watch you do it, and it's feedback, feedback, feedback. So
Yeah. Yeah.
coaching is the most powerful, I think.
I think I'm torn about how to do this because I think I'm going to need to do a part two of this. You're definitely going to be a returning guest. But I have questions that I'm going to ask you about coaching because I think they're important. But just in case I need a place to end this one, what is a piece of advice that you would offer to a teacher who is really at any stage of their career? What is something that a teacher needs to hear and a teacher needs to consider from your perspective as they approach their job every day?
So 2 points. One, that is very important and essential to be a reflective practitioner.
Mm-hmm.
That means giving yourself a brutal look at how what you planned went.
Mm-hmm.
Not what you planned, not looking at what you planned, because you have some people that can write phenomenal plans.
Yeah.
But what were the unintended consequences that came up, and how did it impact the flow of your lesson?
You just freeze? Oh, that's because you're speaking truth.
Okay.
Did you hear me? It's because you're
No.
speaking truth.
Right.
You were
And
saying
did you
how
get to your objective?
Yep.
Right. So in everybody, did you get to your objective?
Mm-hmm.
The next thing I'm going to say is one of the most, in my opinion, important pieces. Like it's like in reading, we talk about decoding, which is sounding out a word and being able to read words, and comprehension, understanding what you read.
Uh-huh.
You're not reading unless you're comprehending. Otherwise, you're just decoding.
Yep.
So with teaching, I get in trouble for this statement. I've gotten in trouble several times, but I still repeat it because it's what I believe. If learning doesn't occur, teaching did not take place.
Mm.
So your evidence is only, and that doesn't mean that the teacher didn't do any work. It means that they shared information, right? The evidence of teaching taking place is what the child produces, what the learner produces.
Yeah.
either what they articulate or demonstrate in writing, because they will respond with their level of understanding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Always. Yeah.
That, that's excellent. I think the passion that you go into education with, the amount of things that you've done in your career, and like the way that you always advocated for students in like this real kind of ground level personal way, of the many other things that you do, is exactly what makes you royalty, right? I'm just honored to have these conversations with you, right? If I have to do part one, part two, or extended kind of version, I'll cut it here, because one of the things, what I really want to ask is like, in your coaching of teachers, right? Part of it is very, here's how to do a lesson plan, here's how to set up your classroom, here's how to make it through the things of the day. But there has to be a personal piece to it as well, right? Because I'm interested in how you coach like any culture of teacher to deal with any other culture kind of student, and like the dynamics of that are varying and very interesting, whether I'm a white teacher who is teaching a black student, a white teacher with a stereotypical mindset versus a non-stereotypical mindset, a black student, vice versa, right? If I'm a black teacher who is teaching privileged students, if I'm a black teacher who's teaching underprivileged students, there's so many assumptions, there are so many things that I bring into a classroom just off of who I am as a person, right? So how do you coach teachers to be culturally responsive and build culturally responsive pedagogies that are as personal to them and as unique to them as they are, so that they can actually they can actually stand behind the things that they're saying and say them from an informed place, so that they're teaching and not just spewing garbage.
So is that a real time question? You want me to answer that?
Please, can you?
Yeah. So I'm going to do that kind of succinctly. Um, if let's just say I woke up on Tuesday morning and I wanted to get to you, and I don't know where you are, and I said, Jacob, I want to come see you. How do I get there? What is the first thing you're going to ask me?
Where are you?
Exactly. Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
So although we like it in a nice, neat package, and that's what's so powerful about coaching, because you get to understand the person that you're coaching in one-to-one,
Mm-hmm.
getting to know where that teacher is
Mm-hmm.
as an academician before I can take them to where it will be most effective for the student,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if I'm teaching because I want to pass time and I really like acting, if I'm teaching because I'm an art teacher and I really just love art and I want to share it and I have a different image of what teaching is,
Yeah.
if I'm the gym teacher, right? And athletics is my background and I was a stellar athlete.
Right.
All of these, experiences impact how you present, but the ultimate goal is to impact the learner in ways that the learner is successful,
Mm-hmm.
right? So my response to that is knowing the teacher
Yeah.
and what their objective is. And remembering what I said before, school is an academic institution.
Yeah.
We have to acknowledge and be conscious of all the things that feed into making this the ultimate learning environment.
Right.
But to create a holistic learning environment, you have to know the players.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where all of the stakeholders in this process are invaluable, no matter how much time they give you, from the administrator to the secretary to the custodian to the
Right.
parent to the teacher to ultimately to the student.
Right. And I think an integral part of that environment is creating a space where teachers can communicate with each other, and where there can be like an open space kind of dialogue. Because when I ask that question of, okay, well, where are you, you have to know that you're safe enough to tell me where you are.
Exactly. And
Right?
that's in coaching. You build a relationship.
You have to build that relationship. And I think a lot of times we, particularly, I know we didn't get into, in this conversation, we didn't get into like a public versus private like independent school kind of conversation.
Right.
But as an independent school teacher, I think one of the things that is a double-edged sword is the autonomy that I have in my classroom, right? Like I create the curriculum that I teach for my students. And I mean, there are conversations that I have to have, there are certain things that I have to have in it, but really, I don't really run it by anybody, right?
Right.
I get to teach what makes sense in my world, and I think part of where that can really go wrong is what if I have some personal things that nobody's ever worked through with me, right?
Correct.
And so
Correct.
I'm grateful for your presence in the Black royalty space, because we've been creating this network that allows for educators to be in conversation with each other in a way that you're not getting judged for, right? You're not getting any type of, there's no discipline attached to any of this, there's no grade for it, right?
Right.
It's just about the development, because if we're not developing, if we're stagnant, we're dying, you know.
Correct.
um
Correct.
and our students are always getting younger, our students are always in a world that we haven't inhabited, like we're farther and farther away from where our students are at every single point, right?
Absolutely.
And so
Mhm.
we have to continually be working on how we are thinking reflectively and also creatively about the future,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Do you like, how do you balance that? How do you balance learning the lessons and repeating what you did versus doing it differently for the sake of the new people in front of you? Because like, I think that's a massive question in and of itself, because in
Mhm.
any arena that you're talking about, what is innovation versus too soon? What is
Mhm.
innovation versus we don't do it that way, we don't do that here? And um, here, I'll stop that question there for a second, because how do you balance those two kind of forces for yourself?
Right. And you do balance it with open discourse, and that's why schools have mission statements and visions, right? And
Mhm.
you get to understand whether you're in alignment with the vision and mission of the school or you're not, right? And going back to what is the main objective, because all of these things play into teaching and learning, right? And so coming back to what is the objective of this school is what's essential, because that's what's going to have you decide whether or not what you want to teach is a fit or not.
Mhm.
And if communication doesn't remain open, when you operate in a silo, everything looks right,
Right,
because you're only taking in information that agrees or supports what you're doing.
right.
But when you can have a healthy communication that may not agree, but there's an understanding why it's a fit or an effective fit or not an effective fit, that's a different conversation,
Mhm.
right? And so we have to remember that when we're creating this environment, this learning, this optimal learning environment, right? It's the question is not always whether we agree or disagree. The question is this effective for the learner?
Mhm.
Because my statement is the process of teaching and learning does not change with the age or the cultural background of the learner.
Mhm.
It's still a
Mhm.
process, a very specific process. So
Mhm.
there are boundaries and guidelines
Yeah.
that teachers should have, but they also shouldn't be so rigid that there's not a flow of creativity to impact the learner in front of them,
Right. Right. True.
right? And
True.
so to your point, um, the communication piece is essential.
Yeah.
But embedded in that communication piece is the understanding that this is why we do interviews and this is why we have grade meetings and lead meetings. um, is are we on the same page where we want to take these children? And is your idea is not so much as me saying top down, like, no, don't do that, do it this way. It's
Right.
like, okay, show me how this is going to bring this student to where we want them to be at the end of the year. And then,
Right.
okay.
Right.
And then my job as an administrator to say, consider this or go with it. Let's see where we go. And
Yeah.
we will, and for those that are kind of out of the box thinking, it becomes okay, let's check back in with this in a week
Right.
instead of at the end of a quarter, because
Right.
some ideas don't need to take all the way to the end of the quarter. And they just don't, because you were dead on day 2. So
So true. So true. And I think we got a really fascinating example of that with how we all changed and changed our styles throughout the pandemic, right? Throughout going to
exactly.
remote school and reconsidering what we were doing and why we were doing it. I also think it revealed that a lot of the decisions that we're making are not with the students in mind, and they're not with the students prioritized. And like how are we coming back from it, and like what lessons are we taking from it? I think we have to investigate further. I mean, my school more or less declared that the pandemic is over the other day. Like
Okay.
tomorrow will be the first day where masks are completely optional on campus, right? Vaccinated, unvaccinated, or there aren't many unvaccinated people on campus, but no matter your vaccination status, your mask is optional. And they sent out this long message, kind of just thanking us for the process, and noting that this was a significant change and a significant marker in like coming back and having events again and doing things. I think we're so excited to do that that we're kind of rushing to, okay, we're back, so things are back as they were. When we had this whole chunk of time, this whole thing happened, and we're not talking about it. We're not addressing it the right way because
Right.
there's so many things connected to it that we're just gonna be dealing with. I can't tell you for how long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure, for sure. But just and to your point, really quickly, um, it speaks to everything that we've been speaking about how does this impact the learner, right? And so everybody has different ideas and visions of what they think is needed. And that's where, if you're working in an institution, you have to kind of bring it to a one pager of, are we at least all going in the same direction? Because the children, as well as the teachers, need to be re-socialized. Because
Yeah.
people have a different image because they call it social media.
Right.
Nobody's real on there,
Right.
right? So how do I now? Because you now you see me full body, so I can't have on my shorts and have my face all made up and have this shirt on that is so cute. Now you have children who this is a real thing for. What am I going to wear to school?
Right. Right.
Right? Because I can play it off with different scarves and things. So that's a minor thing. But also, how do I interact when I can't just turn the channel or stop watching? And my
Right.
life is not a TikTok. Like, how do I have a communication when I disagree with what you say and I can't just blurt out of my mouth what I would write on a piece of paper because you can't see me?
Right. And I can't just shut you out, you know. You can't.
But yeah, there's a lot into that. And that's a whole nother conversation when we talk about the impact of the pandemic on
Yeah.
teaching and learning, what it's revealed,
Yeah.
and what we've learned from it.
So as we turn to wrap this just episode up a little bit, we talked about your advice to teachers. What advice do you give to students at this time of their educational career, like wherever they're at right now?
Wow. I think the strongest advice that I would give to students is that you're in competition with no one but yourself to be your best self, right? So wherever you are, the next paper you write, the next test you take, if you get a 0, then the very next time you get at least a 1, right?
Okay.
And as a good friend of mine always says, make new mistakes.
Make
Don't do the same ones you did before.
any
Make a new mistake.
mistake you make more than once is a decision. Also, uh, wonderful, Dr. Rivers. How would people get in contact with you in the real world?
Oh, in the real world. I have a website, askdrrivers.com. I'm also on YouTube if you want to see some of my work. And my email address would be at revitalizeminds.com, because Revitalize Minds is my business. Like, wake up your brain and think some new creative things.
Awesome. There are millions of things for me to thank you for, but I'll blanket them all with a wonderful thank you for being here. You can always find more information with us at blackroyalty.ed@gmail.com. and on blackroyalty.ed on Instagram, Twitter, and all those things. Like, comment, subscribe, do all the things. See you soon.